I always think that history to a city is a lot like memory it is to an individual. Because as an individual, we have memories, and we look back on our memories, we see our mistakes, and we see what we did right, and that's what history should be about with a city too.
The town of Wickenburg was founded by Henry Wickenburg in 1863. It unofficially became a town following an April 24, 1909 vote by citizens. 35 local residents voted to incorporate, and 5 voted against becoming a town. The successful election allowed Wickenburg to elect a mayor and 4 aldermen. The election of town officers was held on June 19, 1909. This is the date that marks the birth of Wickenburg. Henry Wickenburg, whose full name was Johannes Henricus Wickenburg, didn't live long enough to see the community he founded in 1863 incorporate and set up its first official government. In 1905, he was 85 years old and in poor health. One day he walked to a grove of trees near the Hassayampa River, and his life ended. His death also ended a pivotal era in Wickenburg. The Wickenburg Centennial. 100 years of incorporation. Wickenburg's history can be divided into eras. First there was mining. Then came ranching and agriculture. The railroad arrived in the 1890s. These preceded dude ranching and tourists looking for our warm desert climate. The construction of major highways through Wickenburg allowed us to be more accessible, many of whom stayed in what seemed to be an endless line of motels. Woven throughout Wickenburg's history has been our worldwide reputation as an historic Western town. In its early years, long before incorporation, Wickenburg was created because of gold mining. It all began when Henry Wickenburg and his companions discovered Vulture Mine.
The people in Wickenburg were feeling very optimistic in 1909. You can see that from what had happened in the previous decade. I think what drove that confidence was a continued faith in mining and the mining economy. The Vulture had been a problematic mine for some time. In fact, in 1897, it was sold at a tax sale. The people in Wickenburg, and certainly people in the mining business here, felt that there were other prospects and other mines in the area that would take up the slack. And there was a sort of an influx of investors and people looking to develop mines, mining engineers. And all of this combined, I think, to make people here feel like they really had a future. What we know, looking back on the past, is that mining wasn't the future for Wickenburg. It was tourism and the highway.
Vulture Mine was located in a desolate desert region, so it could not support a large population of miners and family members. Many of them lived closer to the river. The settlement attracted other miners and businesses. Vulture Mine began its decline in the 1870s. The town of Wickenburg's very existence is due to mining. Without the discovery of gold at Vulture Mine in the 1860s, the town may not have been founded nor incorporated. As Mark Pry said in his book, The Town on the Hassayampa, although Wickenburg was known to most Arizonans as a mining community, what sustained the town during the difficult years was farming. The rich soil along the Hassayampa riverbank made the growing of crops possible for centuries. Anglos and Mexicans following the local gold rush used farming as a fallback profession. Pumpkins, squash, barley, wheat, corn, alfalfa, potatoes, fruits and vegetables all were grown locally and allowed early residents to make a living. One of the more productive farmers was Henry Wickenburg. Carmen Molina Garcia remembers early Wickenburg corrals.
Well, they were made out of poles. You know, we had a lot of trees there and a lot of cottonwood, and they were made mostly out of mesquite poles. Sometimes they were a little bit crooked.
One of the worst disasters in Arizona history occurred about 30 miles upstream from Wickenburg at the Walnut Grove Dam. The dam broke on February 22, 1890, about 2 a.m. following heavy rains, causing a wall of water to rush toward Wickenburg, destroying everything in its path. The exact death toll is unknown, but estimates range from about 50 to 70. All of the ranches anywhere near the river were totally destroyed. The tragedy made national news. The Vulture mine was in rapid decline. Now the Walnut Grove flood caused damage to the fertile farmland that would never be repaired. Wickenburg was in decline. But unlike so many other Arizona mining settlements, Wickenburg refused to become a ghost town.
Well, there's no doubt that Wickenburg was going to survive. There was going to be a town here because there are some pretty obvious reasons to have a town here. One is that there is a water source. The other thing was that this was a transportation crossroads.
The railroad helped rescue Wickenburg's economy. The Santa Fe, Prescott, and Phoenix Railroad arrived in Wickenburg in March of 1895. State historian Marshall Trimble says Wickenburg was a main link in western Arizona.
And that's what historians call the closing of the frontier in Arizona's history, when the line linked between Ash Fork through Prescott, Wickenburg, and linked up with Phoenix. And so Wickenburg was on that line, and so that made it very important.
The rail line had a modest impact on the local economy when it first started. In its first year of operation, the net revenue for the railroad from Wickenburg was less than $1,000. In the second year, it increased slightly to just under $2,000. Of all the stops on the rail line, Wickenburg did the smallest amount of business in its early years. The true impact of the railroad in Wickenburg would not be felt for over 20 years. It provided the necessary transportation to bring tourists to town. In large part because of the railroad, the way was paved for Wickenburg to become known as the Dude Ranch capital of the world. When Wickenburg entered the 20th century, it was not much more than a dusty and rural western town.
I'd like to tell about when we first got here. It was interesting because Wickenburg was just a small, dusty little town. We had the law in Wickenburg was one sheriff, and the sheriff spent all his time rounding up stray cattle and putting them in corrals until somebody either claimed them or else he could auction them off. And that was his main function at the town, our only law in Wickenburg.
There was no library, no bank, and no electricity, and there was no permanent church building until 1902. We got our first newspaper, the Wickenburg News Herald, in 1901. The second newspaper, The Miner, began in 1904. In 1905, Elizabeth Smith established the Vernetta Hotel on what is now Frontier Street. Smith was one of the few African-American residents. The Vernetta Hotel was an attractive two-story building. It was the premier hotel in the Hassayampa region.
But that brings to mind a picture of the hotel she has down there, taken in probably 1907 to 10, and a big man standing by my dad and my dad's dog, Shep, black dog, about 50 feet towards the cameraman. The cameraman was taking the picture from about the railroad.
The Vernetta Hotel attracted train passengers looking for a brief stopover, and visitors who were probably the first wave of tourists to Wickenburg's warm temperatures. One of the first community improvements to arrive with the 20th century was education. The Garcia School, today known as the Little Red Schoolhouse on Tegner Street, was built in 1905. It began operating the following year and had an enrollment of 58 children. The one-room school is still standing.
My aunt has a little canteen about big, and she said that all of them had a little canteen about that big, and they strapped it around their neck and they walked to school. That was their school water. And at the end of the day, if they didn't have any water left, that was it. So apparently when she was going to the Little Red Schoolhouse there, they didn't have running water.
The land for the school was donated by Ignacio Garcia. The structure cost $1,600 to build. In 1908, a second teacher was hired to assist with the growing student body. The Little Red Schoolhouse was the forerunner to what would eventually become Wickenburg's highly rated school system. Staying true to its Western roots, Wickenburg was home to a pioneering physician. Dr. Floyd Breuer was the primary doctor for all of Western Arizona. People traveled to Wickenburg from as far away as Parker to seek his medical help. Dr. Breuer founded the Wickenburg Hospital. In 1914, the nation's eyes were on the last, and what turned out to be, the wildest and now forgotten Cactus Derby car races. The route went from Los Angeles to Phoenix and right through Wickenburg. Remember, this is 1914. Internationally known race car driver Barney Oldfield participated in the race. In fact, he made a brief stop in Wickenburg.
And his car was covered with mud, and he stopped in front of the bakery, which was on Tegner Street, and we all talked to him. All the while he was talking, he had his old cigar in his mouth.
Near the end of the race, which was close to Wickenburg, all the drivers except two had fallen behind. It was now a neck-and-neck race between Louis Nickrent and Barney Oldfield. Oldfield got bogged down in the river crossing near Wickenburg and was actually the second to cross the finish line, but won due to a timing technicality. In 1942, the Army Air Corps began training glider pilots at Echeverria Field at what is now called Forepaugh. Many of these pilots participated in the Normandy invasion. After the war, several continued to live in Wickenburg. In the 1950s, Soviet Union propaganda accused the U.S. of having concentration camps at 6 different locations across the nation. Forepaugh was one of the federal extermination camps referred to in the government-run Soviet news media. These reports infuriated Wickenburg Mayor Delbert Kirby. On May 21, 1952, he sent a colorful but scathing letter to the Russian dictator Joseph Stalin. He called Stalin nuts and said he was crazy as a horse which has just made a breakfast off loco weed. The mayor agreed there was a federal facility west of town, but it only contained rattlesnakes, a few of which he offered to send Stalin. In 1909, when Wickenburg was incorporated, its population was about 500. About half were Mexican Americans. That year, Wickenburg had about 40 businesses, including saloons, retail stores, agriculture-related businesses, boarding houses, and blacksmith shops. Although Wickenburg was more than 30 years old in the 1890s, it still had not been platted. Henry Wickenburg hired P.C. Bicknell to survey the town site in early 1897. Soon after, a plat map was recorded with Maricopa County. Historian Dr. Mark Pry says Wickenburg could not have incorporated as a town without a government-recognized plat.
The businesses that you need to attract to establish a tax base are not going to come in until they know that there is a formal, regulated system of property sale and ownership. And the only way you can have that is with a grant of land to the town company from the federal government. And they didn't get this till 1897. Once they had that, then they were in the position to incorporate.
The first councilmen, at that time they were called aldermen, were R.W. Baxter, John Bachtiger, Felipe Garcia, and C.H. Widmeyer. Wickenburg's first mayor was Henry Cowell, a prominent local merchant. During the past century, mayors and council members have represented all Wickenburg citizens in the successful efforts to keep Wickenburg a vibrant and important part of Arizona. During the past 100 years, many communities have come and gone. But because of the Wickenburg residents, mayors, and councils, our town has not only survived, we have thrived. Mining, ranching, the railroad, and now tourism have all contributed to our success. Because of our citizens and leadership over this past century, Wickenburg now is recognized around the world as a unique Western town. Arizona's state historian Marshall Trimble says if it weren't for Wickenburg, Phoenix would not even be here.
But interesting about Wickenburg, Wickenburg is really the mother of Phoenix. And a lot of people down in Phoenix don't like to admit that or accept that maybe, but it's really true. It was a group of Wickenburg people, 16 of them, and old Jack Swilling, who was one of Arizona's most unappreciated citizens, I think. Jack Swilling took this group down to clean out those Hohokam canals and ditches and start a community, which by 1868, there was a little settlement there with just a few people. They were going to call Phoenix a couple of years later.
Transportation paved the way for dude ranching and tourism in Wickenburg. First, there was the railroad. Then in 1914, the first Hassayampa River concrete bridge was constructed. In 1922, Wickenburg became a major junction community. Highways leading to California, Phoenix, and points northward to Prescott, Flagstaff, and the Grand Canyon all met in Wickenburg. A major transcontinental highway, Highway 60, now traveled through Wickenburg. Major bus lines also went through Wickenburg beginning in the 40s. One bus station was located at the southwest intersection of Wickenburg Way and Tegner. In 1916, a major Hassayampa River flood ravaged Wickenburg and destroyed the concrete bridge. In the 1920s, the second Hassayampa Bridge was built. Stronger bridges were built in the 1930s and 1960s. Wickenburg's prominent role in tourism would not be realized without substantial bridges across the river. Well into the 20th century, Wickenburg's Wellick Field Airport became the latest mode of transportation for the region. The first plane to land at the Wickenburg Airport was a Curtiss JN-4 Jenny biplane in 1917. Today, the Wickenburg Airport serves jet aircraft and planes from around the nation. Wickenburg became an internationally recognized tourist center in the 1920s. A perfect storm of elements made this possible. Warm winter weather, great railroad connections, and a new national highway going to the West Coast and to Phoenix. With a growing number of tourists visiting the West and searching for Old West experiences, Wickenburg was in the right place at the right time. It offered the world dude ranching.
Wickenburg has changed its capital industry. At least when we first came here, it was sort of a sheep center, and then it turned into a cattle center. And then after the guest ranches got started, later on there were 7 major guest ranches here in Wickenburg. And as they progressed, this became the dude ranch capital of the West.
The first guest ranch to open to the public was the Bar FX Ranch in 1923. A guest ranch pioneer here in Wickenburg was Romaine Loudermilk. Sometime around 1925, he began the KL Bar Ranch. Loudermilk eventually became a national showbiz star. He was a regular performer and singer on the old WLS Barn Dance national radio program. Pete Fletcher was the longtime assistant manager of Remuda Ranch. He recalls Loudermilk here in Wickenburg.
He used to come to our ranch down at the old Bar FX. He was quite an accomplished entertainer. He could play the guitar and sing and walk on a slack rope in cowboy boots.
The Remuda Ranch, which became one of the longest-running guest ranches in Wickenburg, was opened in the 1920s by Jack Burden and Lewis White. White and Burden parted ways. White opened the Monte Vista on a hillside overlooking the town, and Burden eventually began building a new Remuda Ranch at its current location on the east side of the river. John Burden, whose mother and father began Remuda Ranch, recalls what the early days of guest ranching in Wickenburg would have been like.
It was much more relaxed in those days, and there was much more of a cohesion, I guess is a good term, involved with the guest ranches and the town. We bought everything here locally in those days. And we would bring our people into the bars, and they would be perfectly welcome. And it was a much more relaxed time. Everybody knew everybody on a first-name basis, and it was a lot of fun.
At its peak, there were 8 dude ranches in Wickenburg. Guest ranching still plays an important role in our local economy. The Rancho de los Caballeros Guest Ranch began operation in the 1940s. Dallas Gant Sr. was an original owner. Los Caballeros invented many new industry changes, which are now standards for guest ranches. Dallas Rusty Gant, a former Wickenburg mayor, now runs the business his father began. He says the future of guest ranching is dependent on change.
The business is definitely changing. For instance, when I was a kid, we had, it was not unusual for people to come and stay. Well, by the time I was a kid, they didn't stay for the whole winter, but then they would stay for months. They'd come and just stay with us. Now, if you get them for a long weekend or 2 weeks, you feel really fortunate to have them. So the length of stays is shortening, the amount of places people can go, and importantly, the ease of which they can travel to other warm destinations to escape winter weather is increasing. It's, for instance, it costs no more to fly on an airplane from Chicago to Phoenix now than it did 40 years ago. But you can also go to the Caribbean, you can go to Florida, you can go to Mexico, exotic locations. So the business is having to change. You can't just offer the desert and riding. Now we have all kinds of activities with the spas, exercise trails, stuff that we never would have thought we'd be getting into years ago. So you try and tailor it to a different type of traveler. They travel, take more trips, shorter trips, on shorter notice, and they're more active when they get here.
Rodeos in Wickenburg can be traced back to 1890, but they were also an outgrowth of Wickenburg's dude ranch industry. Longtime Remuda assistant manager Pete Fletcher says the rodeos first began as a way to keep the ranch guests and tourists in town a little bit longer.
They used to run the rodeo. We had a 3-day rodeo at the ranch, and all the ranches participated in it. You had to have outside help to run it, and tried to make a going thing of it, and it was meant to prolong the guest season in Wickenburg.
Internationally recognized cowboy Everett Bowman called Wickenburg his home for many years. He was voted all-around champion cowboy of the world in 1935 and 37. He served as head wrangler at the local Flying E Ranch from 1960 until 1962. Bowman died in 1971 in a plane crash near Wickenburg. The guest ranch industry put Wickenburg on the world map. It helped build a healthy local economy. Dude ranches solidified Wickenburg's role as an Arizona tourism center. Making tourism possible were the same things that helped create dude ranches: weather, our Old West lifestyle, roads, and rail. These were Wickenburg's strengths: weather, the Old West, roads, and rail. Although rail transportation eventually began to decline, roads were improved and our weather and Old West lifestyle remained strong. Tourism also allowed Wickenburg to reach back into its past, and use its mining history as a way to attract tourists. Mining provided our direct link to the Wild West. So did the massacre west of town. On November 5, 1871, 6 stagecoach passengers were murdered west of Wickenburg. Among those killed that day was Frederick Wadsworth Loring, a journalist from back east, who was described as one of America's most promising writers. We highlighted our ties to the land when the Hassayampa River Preserve opened its doors. The preserve was once a stagecoach stop. Later, it was one of the first guest ranches in the area and eventually was acquired by the Nature Conservancy to highlight Wickenburg's unique terrain. The annual Gold Rush Days has been a staple of Wickenburg's tourism industry since 1948. This huge 3-day Chamber of Commerce event attracts 40,000 to 50,000 visitors. It is a celebration of Wickenburg's rich Western and mining heritage. The annual Desert Caballeros horse ride started about the same time as Gold Rush Days. Roy Coxwell, whose family owned a tourist camp during the Depression era, remembers the first ride.
The first ride, actually, there was about 50 riders, horseback. They were enjoying themselves. And next year, there were probably 75, and the following year, possibly 100.
The Desert Caballeros ride also has evolved into a major element of Wickenburg's tourist attractions. This week-long adventure attracts hundreds of people from all over the world and from all walks of life. The arts in Wickenburg are emerging as important to our local tourism and the entire state. For example, the Del Webb Center is recognized nationally as a venue for major performances. The famous bola tie was invented right here in Wickenburg in 1949 by Vic Cedarstaff, a local silversmith. This uniquely Western neckwear is recognized worldwide and adds to Wickenburg's reputation as a true Western town. Because of our great location on Highway 60 and 93, we became a major stopover for cross-country travelers. Attractive motels and many gas stations lined the highways entering and leaving town. So did restaurants and other tourist services. Millions of tourists went through our town on the way to and from California. For many years, we were on the only direct route between Los Angeles and Phoenix. The Desert Caballeros Western Museum in Wickenburg is recognized worldwide for capturing the historical Old West. Frontier Street and our downtown area reflect an era of Arizona history that is rapidly disappearing in other parts of the state. The Hassayampa Well and its legend of not telling the truth if you drink its water has fascinated tourists for decades. Wickenburg is on the only direct route between Phoenix and Las Vegas, so 7 to 8 million cars per year travel through our town. Of course, the warm weather temperatures attract tourists from around the world. We have our share of ties to the political and showbiz world as well. Vice President Dan Quayle is in Wickenburg on occasion to visit family members who live here. Former Reagan Interior Secretary Jim Watt has a home in Wickenburg. Actor Val Kilmer is frequently in town visiting family members. There are many stories of high-profile political and Hollywood personalities who visit our rehabilitative centers. Wickenburg was founded in 1863. 46 years later, on June 19, 1909, we became an official town. It was this date 100 years ago today that Wickenburg was incorporated. For 1 century, Wickenburg citizens have produced scores of local leaders, leading up to our current mayor and council. This glimpse into Wickenburg's bygone era clearly reveals that our town has a world-recognized historic past and a promising and exciting future.
People knew that statehood was coming, and I think Wickenburg thought, we want to be a part of that, we want to be a city, and that's probably what motivated them.
Wickenburg is still positioned in the Valley of the Sun, and Arizona is still known as a sun destination.
People lived the way they had to live. That's the way it was.
It was a multi-ethnic, multi-racial community. It was clearly, in some ways, a homogeneous community because everyone here, to some extent, depended on the same things for their living.
It was a wonderful time in those days.
So it's always good to look into the past as you build for the future.
The whole thing about Wickenburg was that the people were so friendly. They were always glad to see you and they wanted you to stop and visit. We were fascinated by it.
There's a town way out in Arizona. It's the place you really ought to see. Out beside the Hassayampa River. That's the only place I want to be. I know that someday I'm gonna travel back to Arizona, way out Wickenburg way, where all the folks have a howdy and the skies are seldom cloudy, way out Wickenburg way. I'll take my guy and find a preacher, and when he's made us one, we'll ride away to a hideaway in the Valley of the Sun. I'm putting cares right behind me. From now on you're gonna find me way out Wickenburg way in Arizona.